Thanks for coming. It's Friday night. Oh, we're not supposed to say that. Cut that out so when people watch it on YouTube, they don't know what day it is. All right, now we're serious. Welcome to the College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Technological University. My name is Carl Dobman, and I'm the Dean of the college. Our college is united with a broad and inclusive sense of design. We offer degrees in architecture, interiors, graphic design, game design, and product design. And we seek these productive overlaps between these disciplines and other degrees offered at the university. We also recently launched a new graduate degree in design and technology, which results from these productive overlaps. Our lecture series allows us to engage in design discussions and offer broad perspectives on where we imagine design is heading, and the lecture series allows us to bring visionary designers to campus to share their ideas, and today also their books, and engage with our students and faculty. The lecture is also supported by a grant that the college received from the Gensler Charitable Gift Fund to promote multidisciplinary design. Mark your calendars for our next lecture on April 1st at 12:30 with Alexis Kim from Smith Group. Today we have the pleasure of hosting Christian Unverzagt from M1 DTW. I said we've known each other for 30 years, but I think we're saying 25 years. Yeah. So I've known Christian for 25 years. We both began our teaching careers together at Taubman College, and our faculty offices were next to one another. It was that same year that Christian finished, or the previous year, Christian finished his degree at SciArc and returned to Detroit. And he moved to Detroit, and I don't mean like Detroit, I mean Detroit, Detroit. And from the beginning, 25 years ago, when he came back, he decided to move to Detroit and found his office there. And he's been going super strong ever since. He's an associate professor of practice in architecture at Taubman College. He also founded M1DTW, a nationally recognized architecture and creative studio working to reshape practice. M1DTW's projects range from creative workspaces to adaptive reuse projects. And those adaptive reuse projects do an incredible job of building on those existing conditions and the kind of richness that's found throughout Detroit. I've always been super impressed by Christian's ability to move between roles and scales. His architecture work has a strong identity, and his graphic design work is super clean and has an amazing aesthetic. And these two things blend and move back and forth between one another. Christian's received numerous awards for his work, including over a dozen honor awards from AIA Michigan and AIA Detroit, and a 50 Books, 50 Covers Award from the American Institute of Graphic Arts for one of the best designed books of the year. M1DTW was recently recognized with a Best of Practice Award from the Architect's Newspaper in the Small Firm Midwest category for its projects portfolio and notes on a practice. His work's been widely published in outlets including Dezeen, Wallpaper, Fast Company, the Architect's Newspaper, Detroit Design Magazine, Salon Today, Architectural Record, Azure Magazine, and many others. I recently had the chance to see Christian and M1DTW share their work at the annual Michigan AIA Design Retreat. He brought a ton of portfolios and books to that presentation, and after I saw it, I thought it would be a great moment to share with our students, which is what results in what we see today and what's in the back of the room. And Christian will talk about those. And again, because of that crossover between graphic design and architecture, it's a chance to talk about how architects represent themselves through their printed work and through their portfolios. So today's lecture is titled Notes on a Practice, as you can see all around the room. It's so nice to have Christian joining us at LTU and sharing his work. So please help me welcome Christian.
Thanks, Carl. It's an honor to be here today. I was born in Southfield, Michigan. So I'm going to talk about our notes on a practice. I'm going to touch on some things. It's sort of an evolving set of notes that have emerged over time. Some we declared early, others are kind of rooted in what we did, and we've just sought to now make them a little more explicit. I'm going to rewind a little bit. I think this is more than just showing 5 projects. I want to talk about what it's like to be a student. For me, I really look to music in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, kind of the emergence of independent music, community ideas and art, how punk and garage developed, and saw kind of a model in a number of independent record labels that found ways to kind of put out the kind of work in their community. But then I grew up in Michigan, and what do we know about Michigan? Like, it's pretty flat. So yes, I was born in Southfield. I had a grandfather who was a bus driver in the city of Detroit, and the other was a brick mason. I'm also a first-generation college student. I don't know if you knew that. And what I did discover is that I could transform the world around myself by how I read the environment and acted on it. So early on, by any means necessary, I'd made this drawing based on the wood that was in my parents' garage, right? See things in magazines. How can I escape this flat plane? I'm a pretty quick learner. I was pointed towards drafting classes in high school, and once I ran out of courses, I found myself at a vocational school during the day where they had computers and CAD software. This was back in the 80s, by the way. After a few weeks of drawing bolts, I asked my instructor if I could use class time to design ramps instead, and he agreed. I also designed a logo, and then a friend of mine in the printing class printed up business cards for me. The first 3 ramps were built out in Lake Orion. We had something called the Lake Orion Ramp Development. So we built the Lord 1 and the Lord 2 and the Lord 3. The next 2 we built in Troy over 2 summers. Word got out that I was pretty good at building these. People were building. This was pretty common. We didn't have public skate parks at the time. And people would generally build more ramp than they had material for. So after 2 weeks, they were shredded. So we would design, we would build, and then we would test. And that was the sort of iterative cycle that was really productive at that time in my life. A couple years ago, I was in the foothills of Palm Desert Springs on a hike. Saw something in the middle of nowhere. Turned out to be this, which is almost identical to the ramp I had in my backyard when I was a teenager. So I went back the next year, and this time I took my skateboard and skated that sucker. All right, so some of the notes on a practice. So the practice is not interested in disciplinary silos, and the practice strives to find a balance between expertise and naivete. You might get a sense of that if you look at our website by the range of work that we do or we've done. And we say that we design a whole host of things. Some all the time, some we haven't done in a while, some we've given the chance to do and would love to do it again. I told Carl I'm a little reflective this year because, as he pointed out, like the practice just celebrated 25 years. And my teaching career sort of mirrors that, kind of lags behind just a little bit more. But we began M1DTW officially 25 years ago with a commission for a conference table in a former warehouse dock in Detroit. One piece of furniture. Now, it was a big table. It was a conference table. We basically took the position we didn't want to design one piece of furniture, so we sought to expand the scope and design the entire space. This is the site we found. It was well underway. We got the commission. I think our proposal was dated February 4th, 2000, so that's kind of the kind of date zero. It was too late to really change lots of things, so we thought just to add another layer. So rather than painting, we applied new materials that began to sort of screen or obscure or sort of interplay with what was there. Early on, we were design build, so we were welding things on site, building this large ghost wall, as we called it, that was clad in polycarbonate. Back at the shop, we were crafting the table, doing things we shouldn't do, we were told not to do by Shopmaster. I think as we were running these planks through, I was standing on the table saw with a hockey stick, like keeping good pressure to run these through. 20 feet long, 5 feet wide, sort of single monolith with legs at one end hanging from that winch. It was interesting coming from school where you were working abstractly, not knowing what you were doing. It was a unique moment for me to walk into that space and say, we have to hang the table from that. But then we had to figure out exactly how to do that. In the end, the chain went through a large hole in the slab, and then there was a rod held in tension. If you were to lift the table, that rod could fall out, and you were there left holding the table. So that first project led to a series of related projects in quick succession. So this was for a radio station. Someone saw that, had us do their sound studio. Someone next door while we were working on the sound studio said, we need our office built out. So we did a workspace. And that workspace knew someone that wanted to open a salon. So 2 years and 3 design build projects later, we had 3 separate contracts for a project with a client that we still work with today. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. I'd say the practice strives to craft lasting, durable spaces for people to do their best work. The practice also strives to be a place for its people to do their best work too. A fairly recent project, the Oak Ridge Dental Center, might take a moment to load. That's our office with the blue dot. We're in the Eastern Market. So out in Rochester Hills, near a roundabout, is this compact little building. You could see it sited. It's a little square, a couple of skylights. Our whole idea was essentially to bring people in, kind of flip the orientation, bring them into the site, and take them into the building for a sort of calming experience where they were completely removed from the automobile. So if you know anything about medical buildings, they're pretty regular in terms of their kind of operatories or patient rooms. So there's a really strict organization that becomes repetitive. So we sought ways to diminish that repetition, providing a pair of windows in every single operatory. So when you're in the chair, you could see the sky, you could see the ground, you could see the clouds, but not see the cars. The north facade on the top sort of faces the parking lot, so there's absolutely no view there. There's one little bunny window in the lower right, and then the south facade, which obscures the kind of repetition within. We had a really strict budget on this project. I think 200 square feet of glass. We bargained for a little more at the kind of entryway, just the way we kind of structured this project with a builder. So we added a series of skylights as well to sort of cheat some of the light and bring it into a number of the spaces within. These are the 2 that are in the reception area. Kind of one that backs up to the parking lot, and then another in the middle. And as you walk through, we sought to choreograph moments where you enter a common corridor and be able to see all the way through the building out to the site beyond. So under construction, of course, and once it's completed. This was the only area that didn't have a concrete floor. We sort of upgraded the finish in the waiting area. There's a blue core that helped orient you. And then, giving the largest window to the person that was always sort of in this office, sort of day in and day out. And then there was a room in the middle of the plan that had its own skylight and a flanking window on either side to be able to visually connect to the outside. And then we started to do things with the materiality. It's a small building, so we tried to elevate the material by using a brick. Our kind of argument, we used the sort of wider or longer Norman size brick. The idea was it's less labor. You pick up the brick, you actually get more coverage. We used transition brick when they're changing the sort of color on the kiln at a discount because we knew we were going to cover it with a mineral paint. And then we flipped the bricks around at the entryway so they had a kind of rich texture on the back. We photographed it on a rainy day. So how often do you hear people talking about what you do in school and how it's different from the real world? So I began school at 5 years old, as many of you did, and I'm still a student. I've never left. And maybe I can say the same thing about skateboarding. There's an academic life, a professional life. Right? I've had a few jobs that I had in high school and in college, but I'm not really sure I've had a job since I began studying architecture. Nonetheless, I think maybe this is the way my clients sometimes see me, and this is the way my students sometimes see me. So I don't know, am I here? Is this the space I occupy? But I don't know, I don't really see a difference between those. For me, they're almost coincident and identical, and really two aspects of the same thing, if you ask me. So I would think about that as a student. During my thesis year in graduate school, I made 100 drawings on 22 by 30 inch arches paper titled Projected Coincidence. These were about establishing a work practice that involved working with aspects of a project out of your control. Normally in school, you get to make every decision. Right? You're handed a paper, there's a brief. You're supposed to honor a bunch of those constraints. You often don't. So I tried to figure out ways to do that. So this was part of my practice and how I could get going. So one of the first things I did, this is sort of the second phase of work that I did in the second sort of concluding semester. And I just sat down and said, I need to get to work. I'm going to make some pencil drawings. So I took pencils, number 2 pencils, and I said, what can I do with them with this sheet of paper? So here's what happens when you take a pencil straight out of the box and don't sharpen it and run it across the sheet down. And then you flip it over and go the other way up. It doesn't leave a mark because it's just erasing. Then you run out of the eraser and the metal starts to make a mark. Or you strip a pencil all the way down to the lead and then freehand it across the sheet, and then you have control. Maybe you start to lose control. Or you sharpen the pencil and you just try to walk it. And these are the marks it will leave. Or another one where you just sort of tap it around the sheet to see what it can do. I poked myself, no blood. So the notes were added afterwards as a record of what I did, what the rule was. So those were pencils. Then I started looking at pennies as a way to think about other practices or material, chance. So I flipped 100 pennies. This was the result. And I found a way to leave some marks on that sheet. Some more research on pennies. So this is practices. This is thinking about techniques. Maybe I need a site. So I'm driving around LA, and I made two different floor mat drawings. So one is the highway on the left, and one is the city over 84 hours. So using that material as a constraint, and now trying to sort of do some mark making through driving around the city. This was long before Google Maps and MapQuest. There used to be a book called the Thomas Guide that everyone in LA had as a sort of bound book to know where to go. So I made a drawing of the Thomas Guide. This is kind of one half. There was a right-hand side. I think I flipped some coins, and where they landed, the pages those landed on, those were my sites. And I drove to the center of those sites, just totally arbitrary. But it's a site. What's there? Let me go find it. It's been given to me, like a client calling and saying, here's your site. So I drove around the site, drove around LA, documented these sites, and then saw a distributed program, essentially one of counterfeiting pennies in multiple different sites. So here was the process of annealing, or the process of bathing, or the process of striking metal. And it was a way to sort of like both be sort of liberated, but bound at the same time. And it was a pretty enjoyable year as a student. The practice does not engage in unpaid spec work in hopes of getting the job. We get calls from developers saying, hey, how about you just do this? Nope. The practice does not engage in the use of unpaid design interns. That's a trap we've worked really hard to not fall into. That one book, designed in 2 weeks and printed 2 weeks later, led to nearly 50 other books on art and architecture. I talked about music. I'd say the thing for me, you all have this, I'm sure, with your own music. These were the kind of bands I was into and still am into. Learning that they're mostly art school kids that initially didn't know what they were doing, but then went on to produce some really genre-defining work. I started to learn about typography. Like, I didn't study graphic design, but yet as an architecture student, suddenly found myself being tasked, maybe self-induced, with ways to design books, given my architectural experience. So here's a whole series from the Wallenberg lectures that have uncoded covers and metallic ink. The Charles and Ray Eames lectures, which were generally given by partners in practice. A series on the Michigan debates on urbanism, Martell lectures, mid-century modern Buffalo, and so on. Many of these are here in the back. And then as a student, before we had web pages, I guess maybe we had web pages, we used to hand things out. I would look for opportunities as a student, so I designed the SciArc handbook in 97, 98, sought ways to experiment with the printing, interviewed Ruth, the front receptionist, for advice for new students, and put that in the back. I found a way to contribute to the discourse in the school. Me and my friend Clancy, we put out a bi-weekly zine, 6 issues, stayed up every other Monday night, 6 times in a row, assembling this thing. It had been called Formerly, or Form. We didn't like that name, so we came out with Formerly while we thought of a new name. We just blew up, named it F. We were the Feditors, the editors for F. And it was a lot of fun. Like, something happened where Peter Cook was coming to the school and bringing students from the Bartlett, which was the school in London, and it was called the Bart Drop. And they were looking for places for people to be able to crash. Bartlett students could crash with SciArc students. So we published that announcement in here. And we were super excited about them coming to the school and to see their work. they kicked our ass. So the next week in F, we published our commentary that the BART drop was essentially them coming in, pinning up, stepping back, and taking us down. Their work was stupendous. So it was a time at SCI-Arc when we were talking about the institution, where's it gonna go, what's the important conversations. So maybe this is just a meme before we had social media, but I reflect on this time as a way to sort of comment on this and try to be reflective and say, how can we be stronger? Or an email from the front office saying, hey, there's a message we need you to get out. You can be creative with the graphics. So here's the message above that he sent, and then his okay, and then our version below. And then for the final issue, I think we declared the school dead. But it was a full issue, and lots of people were contributing. There had been a piece in Metropolis magazine about the school. It had just turned 25, so that's kind of weird. But so we restaged, me and a handful of friends, restaged this sort of early photograph that had been taken in SCI-Arc and wrote a letter to Metropolis that they then published. So we put this in there to kind of share this. And we always had a top 10 for music. And so I don't know how well you can see this, but it was like the top 10 ways to make an ass of yourself at SCI-Arc. And one was to pose in the recreation of a nostalgic photo as a means to stake out new territory, or proclaim the school dead. So I think we were both serious and wanted to make fun of these things at the same time. While I was at SCI-Arc, the founder of Archinect was a fellow student. He asked a bunch of us to design shirts for him. This was my contribution. 5 years later, it finally showed up on Archinect and kind of became viral for a little bit. So we reprinted them last year as a kind of 20th anniversary, kind of a tribute to Lester Bangs, totally ripping him off in a way. Here's another book, the kind of first Michigan architecture papers. Maybe the thing I want to say about this is that this book had a hole punched through it. And I didn't know if that was a costly idea or not. And so I often look at a book like this. These were printed in maybe editions of 1,000. And it was a moment where I realized I had to connect with the person who's ultimately going to make the thing and begin a conversation early to see if that's an idea worth pursuing. And that set in motion, I think, a kind of history of engagement with outside makers. These books were small. They couldn't stack up against all the Dutch monographs that were floating around at the time. So one of the projects I built was a case for 13 books. Again, one sheet of paper, that same sheet of paper, I developed this thing. Basically, one piece of plywood, then basically wrapped to produce this thing in the table saw. I did not stand on this table saw, but it was all box joints. One joint, this thing folded around. So it held the most recent version, all of them in the front, and then on the sides, archive copies. Still have this thing, by the way. I've extended some of this to work with my students who produced the journal at Taubman, creative ways to think about printing. So the jackets, 1 year were independent of the book, and then it relied on people at the launch event to decide which way they wanted to fold their jacket and then put it on their book. I think I've been doing this for about 22 years now, so quite some time, and they're all the same size. They're 8 by 10. They try to be 192 pages, but there's no other established constraint for paper or color or typography. There's no established brand. It's basically an unbrand, and the students each year sort of take it up. I have a former Dimensions alum in the room, actually, so maybe she could speak to that a little bit later. We came out of COVID excited about being in the material world, printed new letterhead, and then moved our office 3 months later. Letterhead, business cards, envelopes, all of it. So we just designed a redaction and had our printer rerun everything so we could continue to reuse it. Adaptive reuse. While I was at SciArc, I was asked to design a kind of booklet and a poster for their summer program called Making and Meaning. I designed the exact same thing that could serve both roles. So an untrimmed version and a trimmed version. And so the process of figuring this out kind of in a low stakes way, it was printed the way newsprints printed, sort of resulted in this piece, which 5 years later came back and allowed me to take up a project where the content was duly suited for a project like that. So This Is Not a Book was essentially the Charles and Ray Eames lecture. I think it was a point where I designed, it was the 10th map book in the Michigan Architecture Papers series. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do any more. I've been doing them for almost 10 years. But it was one lecture about two buildings, the Blur building, which you may know, and the I-beam competition entry. And the Blur building had been built and dismantled, it had its own book, so it was a chance to do a single book about a single proposal. And this proposal was about the interrelationship between the presentation and production of art. And so I said, let's do a project about the relationship between the presentation and the production of a book. And so we tried to work through all these different ways to sort of model this thing. We had something that we called counterimposition. Normally, if you design a book, you use software, you put things where you want, and the software reorders it for the device you're printing on. So if you're printing on a large press, it gets sort of reimposed. You don't worry about it. That's the printer's job. But we said, what if we have things that stay in place at the scale of that press sheet? Where do they go? What happens to them? So we reached out to printers, and we didn't tell them we were designing a book. We said we're designing two posters that are folded up and coil bound. And this is the document, the InDesign file, and all the links, because we had to reverse engineer it to work in this way. And in the end, it resulted in something that had this sort of frustrated form because it wasn't trimmed, right? It was basically those two press sheets folded and coil bound. But you could remove the coil binding. You could remove the coil binding, kind of unpack it. You could look at it in this frustrated form. You could kind of open up the press sheets and sort of like look at things at that scale. And then you could put it back together, tear it open, and look at it like a regular book. We spent 18 months on this project, which was longer than any of our built projects at the time. There was one moment where there were probably as many people from the printer's office around a conference table as are in this room right now. It was me and a staffer. It was the two of us and maybe 12 of them. And they said, we didn't want anyone who's going to touch this project to not know what it's about and how it's unique to make this happen. And in the end, it had to go to a specialty bindery outside of Toronto. This one machine is what made it possible. It was able to cut all those perforations, hold the book together, and let it be torn apart. The operator of this machine said this, after he'd worked on this machine for 35 years, and that this machine basically, this project celebrated his work on that machine, and he couldn't have been more proud. And for us, in terms of how we interact with the people that make these things possible, it was kind of really great for us to hear. And then the cover was essentially meant to mask or mimic the facade. Their proposal had this robotic spider that would climb the facade with kind of infrared vision and all kinds of things that proposals do. So this is maybe a kind of homage to that. We've designed books internally. This was a research document we produced for the new owner of the Fisher Building back in 2016. We were given 6 months to sort of spend documenting and gathering and collecting all sorts of aspects of this building. It's a really remarkable building. This wasn't printed in an edition of 1,000. These were just sort of on demand, so we just let it go as big as it needed to be. Took photos of everything that was in their archive, reproduced every single plan, gathered every kind of postcard-like image in sort of one place. It was kind of an atlas or an archaeology for the thing. You may have seen some of our own books, so we sort of take advantage of, I think we take documentation seriously, and so this is sort of a record of our output year over year. It was a project we started in 2008 with the goal of finally completing these in 2020, but we all know what happened that year. So I think the end of 2021 into 2022, we finally got around to doing these. But they're built in the same way and just recompiled in these other case-bound monographs. So I just say, as students working on your portfolio, my advice to you, you're always like, hey, I'm graduating and it's a boom time. I don't need to make a good portfolio because people just want to hire me. Or there's a recession. I just want to get a job. So you make the quickest and easiest portfolio for you to get that job. I would say regardless of the economic condition we're in, whether we're in a boom or a recession or somewhere in between, you need to make the portfolio that you're going to be proud to go back to in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that works there. The process of making a portfolio is a reflective moment, and it's a fleeting moment. So make the portfolio you want to make. Don't make the portfolio that satisfies that silly 5 megabyte PDF limit that people post on their websites. So I guess maybe we've evolved from like this multidisciplinary firm that we described ourselves of, doing design build, to more of like a design deliver format as an architecture and creative practice. So the practice values its time by tracking its time, and the practice pays its staff for every hour of its work. I owe some of this, I think, to the workspaces. We've almost always had a studio to go to work, and maybe more importantly, to be able to leave and go home. From the very beginning, in a basement in Ann Arbor, when I was working on my portfolio for graduate school and building models for former professors, to fighting for a studio space at when I did an exchange at the Bartlett, there was no dedicated studio. There was a closet with 2.5 desks, and I fought for one. Happened to be a window seat. And here's all the kind of remains from the drawings I made during that time. Or when I did my thesis work at SciArc, a room that had been built, studio culture had waned. People were starting to use computers. Computers were big, heavy. They didn't want to bring them into school, so they would go work at home. So they built this room to store computers on carts, and people could wheel them out to their studio. And people did that, and there was studio culture again. And then they had this really cool plywood-lined room that no one was using. So I used this to finish my thesis. I graduated January 15th, along with all my peers, and I showed back up on January 16th. And I treated this as my studio for the next 6 months. If I haven't mentioned it, I've never been one for career goals. I've often been more about career avoidance. In Detroit, as Carl mentioned, this is the studio as part of our shop that we were in for 11 years. We upgraded to some light on the Detroit riverfront for the next 11 years. And the reason we now have reprinted stationery is this office in the Eastern Market, which is much more flexible for the ways we work now. And it's a sort of pleasure to go to the office during the day. Okay, so I talked about a client we had 3 contracts with. For this rundown former record store, we had a contract to do an architectural layout for a salon. And then we had a contract to design all of their furnishings. And then we had a third contract to basically be on retainer, to be responsible for their brand and do any print work they needed for 12 months. So I haven't said this, but we never tried to work without a contract. And I think it's been something that's been very successful for us. Silly as that sounds, there's a lot of people that work without contracts. So just to say, the previous entryway was on center. It was kind of not very efficient for, it was maybe perfect layout for a record store, but not for a hair salon. So we reconfigured the entryway, pushed all the stations to the front. We had this idea about it being a kind of public act, that you were kind of participating in this kind of transformative kind of like moment of publicity. So we were starting to think about branding for the place. It was right on 6th Street in Royal Oak. Some of you may have seen this or a couple of their other locations. It's in crappy condition. It had been a record store. I probably bought some records there, to be honest. But the floor was irregular. You could see the ceiling here. Perfect site because we blew it out, right? We got to like take it down, lift it up, rework the section. The owners had one mandate. They said, we need good light. So we said, okay, we've got all this storefront. We're going to give you light at the back. We're going to pull the ceiling down so there's some nice bounce. And that's what we did, essentially. Some degrees of privacy with some screening down the middle. And this was a sort of project where we started to pivot from design build. We didn't feel comfortable that we could make these things in our shop. So how do we start to work with people that can make the things that can? So the stations were designed by us, and a handful of different fabricators, from acrylic to stainless steel tube bending to forming to welding to mirror sandblasting, all kinds of things. And then we just assembled these on site. So it was much more of this maybe automotive model in that way rather than strictly design build. And then you can see it on the front. We actually had no signage or no sign permit because the sign was a foot inside on the wall. You can see the suspended stations using this sort of heavy gauged stainless steel. That extended to these other tables that were essentially almost like origami, just folding 7-gauge stainless steel to stiffen it, having it cantilever off the wall or mount to the wall. And then maybe we were working on the I-beam book at the same time that we were doing this project, and so we had this idea about hands at work. It wasn't about kind of fashion, it was about hands at work. So we positioned 6 cameras over deliberate areas of work and then gathered them on the sign wall with these 6 LCD screens. So it was hands sort of like washing hair, hands cutting hair, hands blow drying hair, and finally hands handing over cash at the desk. They opened another location, complete opposite. Instead of it's on a corner, 16 feet wide, really long, super narrow. So the palette began to evolve. We started to think we have to do a different station, so we designed a station that pressed into the wall. It was behind the mirror. It didn't really work. They stayed there. Well, the space didn't really work. They were too busy. It was too small, so they moved a couple blocks away. The owners are really hands-on. There's Johnny taking one of the mirrors over himself. Into this new location, where we sort of completely reoriented how you entered this former location from the corner, take you back, and then in. So we sort of created our own internal storefront to be able to walk through. The palette maybe became a little more mature, a little kind of warmer. There was an existing wood floor they wanted to keep, so we said let's embrace that. And you can see how this began to play out. Some of the elements that emerged in their last location, sort of tile enclosed wet area and dry area, show up again here. We learned some lessons when we did the first location, the ceiling suspended stations. We built these brackets that had to be drilled and placed from above, and it was really complicated, and we found ourselves in the plenum working on them. We didn't have a plenum. I wasn't certainly going to be doing that. So just thinking about ways to be smart, to design a bracket that can be easily mounted from below, be easily aligned, accommodate power. The stations went up. Done. We reused and refaced the reception desk, so just thinking about ways to expand. So you see these hands on the far right. When I was at the Bartlett on Exchange, I had an instructor who basically said, I joined midstream. This is why I got that window seat. I think the student who had that kind of bailed. And I show up and I'm like, I can't wait for the project. And he's like, we've been working on the project since October and it's January. He's like, what are you going to do? I'm going to draw. So this essentially began my thesis work a little earlier than maybe I had anticipated. So I just started paying attention to things and seeking ways to document them. So one of the aspects was this thing called Headspace. So I could go get my hair cut for $5 at the Valdelsa Academy, the teaching academy, but I had to spend 3 hours there. So one day there was this hairdresser from Japan, and he would sit there and kind of flick his scissors. He was practicing the holstering of the scissors. So I was like, can I take some photos? So I somehow got lucky, documented that action without a tripod. I think I was using film at the time. Made a whole series of drawings about how hair is cut. Hairstylists actually think in section, and they make abstract cuts. So I was just learning about their discipline and trying to document it in a certain way, never having an idea that I would have a client who was in this business and that might serve me some way. And so I produced a whole series of drawings. You can see a version of those hands. I did a drawing of scissors using kind of black tape. I did a drawing of a comb using Scotch tape. You ever take your fingers across the comb and it makes that sound? That's the sound my drawing made when you took your fingers across it. So just trying to approximate things. Those hands were on their first website. We deployed them within a kind of refresh within one of their locations. And then again, people kept asking, like, are those George's hands? George is one of the owners. I think he had a watch like that or something. And I was like, technically they're Kazu's hands, but at this point, George has paid for them. So yes, they're George's hands. We did all their branding and collateral, as I said. I think in a way, like we used, the thing I'll say is the way we thought of the branding is it had this color red, but nothing in the space was red, right? We didn't actually put red things in. It was just the sort of, this kind of graphic overlay that would show up maybe on a sign or in advertising or in the stationery that they would hand out. And I think the only place these still exist besides the website are their new location in Detroit, right down on Woodward. Similar scheme, trying to bring you back and kind of drop you around. So you enter and you can hear the salon, but you can't quite see it through this mesh curtain. And then you get to the end and you can look back towards Woodward. Kind of redeploying the palette in new and different ways. They've generally found really interesting spaces to occupy. So we had these columns from I think like the 1870s in this building, these cast iron columns. Just before that location opened in 2019, they had a flood above their original location. A pipe burst during like what are those things called? Those polar vortexes. and it flooded the space. And they had all these clients that they were trying to serve. So there was a space, empty tenant space, right next to their other salon location that you could access through a back corridor. And we did a pop-up, basically design and built this thing in 11 days, and they opened 11 days later. So essentially a metal stud, kind of thick wall, some new mirrors. We sort of celebrated the sort of calamity. The mirrors normally would be frosted at the top on this band, so we just added some yellow, hash marks. You can see the demo lighting, the reflected construction fence, and so on. They liked the space so much, they eventually took it over. We sort of adapted it, took the original in-wall stations that had been in storage and pulled them out and used them again. So they'd invested in some durable products that they were able to reuse. There's George. At this point, we designed about half a dozen salons for them. So we published a little book of the portfolios and called it 6 Salons. Okay. LSCO, just maybe a kind of wrap-up project. This is a kind of recent project. If any of you have been down to Little Village, the area near like the Shepherd, this was a project on Detroit's east side for Library Street Collective, the kind of folks that are behind a lot of that development. And they bought this building, and there's a lot of these in Detroit that are in this condition that at one time or another had been kind of blocked in and were used for lots of different things. They wanted it initially to create a couple of artist studios, maybe up to 3 different studios within the space. Sort of looked like this after it was cleaned out. In the end, they decided that they wanted to occupy it, so it was just a space, kind of one space for one tenant. Had a pretty awkward configuration up front with 3 panels, but then an open corner. So one of the things we did, we kind of re-inlaid a new polycarbonate facade at 3 different planes. So the plane on the far right, you'll see, was basically coplanar with the brick, and then it stepped back slightly, and then stepped back a 3rd time and passed behind the column. So this is everything we wanted to save and could save, although actually part of the roof had to, I think, be rebuilt. So essentially, the initial first kind of shell work was essentially this. You can see the original structure. There was a small service area in the corner. They came back and said, we now would like to occupy it, move some of our storage and service sort of aspects for our galleries into this building, and tasked us to basically try and adapt some racking and storage within the space. And so that's essentially what we did. We sort of tracked down a product, had it, rather than taking it in normal Home Depot or Menards colors, we were able to get it custom powder coated with just a longer lead time. Kind of shoehorned these into the space, and then added a kind of like wood face in the kind of more public areas, the office or the entryway. You can see some of the stepping of the facade here. Here's a moment with the 3rd column is now completely outside the building. I guess that's curtains. Just to say, I'll close with this note. Early on, Clark Stevens told us to keep doing what we're doing, which was followed by architect and educator Michael Rotundi, who added, keep doing what you're not doing. So this is maybe the first note that's stuck around, and I like to keep it at the end. And whatever it means to you, I'm going to encourage you to go practice, Someone's going to ask if I still skateboard. I do. And here's some proof. 5 years ago, February 2020, I went 2 weeks ago, so it hasn't been 5 years. But February 2020, I worked myself back up to dropping in on a 13-foot ramp. Took my phone out, I started recording video, and I handed it to someone, and I just said, hey, this is recording. And I stepped up, and I didn't get hurt. Thanks.
We have time for some questions. Geez, Nicholas is going crazy online. Any questions in the room?
Hello, my name is Francisco Diaz. I'm a recent graduate from the Bachelor's of Architecture, and during my study, I realized the importance of multidisciplinary, and so right now I'm doing graphic design as well. You who studied your multidisciplinary design journey later in career, what advice could you give to those who realized it during their studies?
Well, I mean, one thing I'll say is I maybe started it before I knew that there were disciplines, right? I was doing design, build, and graphic design as a teenager, right? I was just doing these things. I found my way to architecture school, which thankfully has lots of room for these things. This is maybe where, you know, I'd say there's all the core skills and abilities we gain in whatever discipline we're in, but if you find something that you're interested in that's related or tangential, like, embrace it, I think is the thing I would say. Like, you know, I became infatuated with typography as an architecture student because I learned about line weight and line type and like how to carefully construct a line and a drawing, and then needed to label it, right? It was a kind of crisis that I needed to now learn about something else. So, you know, I suppose there's a version where I didn't need to learn about that thing, or I didn't care, I wasn't so interested, and I would do enough to get by. So I would say be open where those things are necessary, but like also just embrace other things that maybe aren't always in that silo. Like, that's the opportunity for you to make those connections. There's one other thing I was going to add. The other thing is collaborators. Like, I would say when I was building ramps, I was really good at certain aspects, but I had a partner who would, we'd bump up against each other about certain things, or he would keep going when I was like ready to call it. He's like, nope, I can get this, we can do this better. And so I'd say that happens throughout my career. Like, there's moments where there's different people satisfying those roles or working in those ways, whether they're in the office or they're people we're working with to fabricate or to make something. And it's also to be able to get to a place where they're not able to go, like that that machine operator at the bindery, like, he was there with the skill set and the machinery to make that project possible, right? He wasn't going to somehow do it, but we had to find each other in that way. So I would just be open to like cross collaboration and any opportunities to like hand work off and build upon it with each other, whatever that looks like for you.
Thank you.
like Phil Donahue.
Thank you. I have like a design choice question. So within the dentistry, you said there was that one window that made it like the corridor, like you could see out through the like to the outside. And I was wondering, why didn't you do like a floor to ceiling window? Because I feel like that would make it feel more like you're engaging with the outside than just the.
So, you know, in that project, each of the 6 operatories had 2 windows. And that's not the only time that occurs. Like if you turn the corner, there's another one that looks to the west. That was to the south, and there's one to the west. So there were a number of moments as you would go through that your eyes could now track different relationships. That happens to be one that I was showing, but in many ways it was about, like I said, we had this 200 square foot glass budget. And so we were trying to be more generous for the person that was in that office the whole time. But I think we were also just wanting to really control the point of view, where you were standing and what you could see, to also block out as much as we could.
There was a question online as well. Well, I want to thank you for talking about just working with contracts, never not paying your interns, all of those types of things. And one of the questions online was whether or not the books were self-funded, or how you were able to go about the production of the books as far as the office is concerned.
So I think that's a good question. I'd say they were self-funded in that we used part of our time we might spend documenting our work or dedicated to marketing or things like that. You know, we stumbled across the ability to publish in this way back in 2008. You may have even seen a version of that early mock-up. And basically committed to that format, and every time we finished a project, we basically produced the project portfolio and put it on our website. So those things have sort of been there in that format. Website portfolios are great, but images tend to be the same size. We liked being able to control things in a kind of more precise manner. So we just made those. Made them. Then we were able to combine them into these books. We're basically using kind of an InDesign hack where the exact same file is being referenced in the large book, in the yearbook, and in the 6 salons book. So it's also just trying to not like compound our work. It's like, this is the one. And I think over time we sort of just, we would use it as a way to kind of stop gap if we were waiting to hear back from a client on a phase or something. We would dedicate some time to those things. So we chipped away at it for a long time. But a lot of it was ready to go, in a sense, when we committed to the actually hitting buy on the Lulu store. This one up front.
Thank you for your lecture today. My name is Yuri. I actually can't be far from here. I graduated from UPenn in the architecture program. And before I graduate, I have a few practice in the real situation as well. And one thing I find is very interesting is that, like, in the real time, your beautiful plan or rendering is not really like what you build in the real scene. And I saw from your work that a lot of them is with great creativity and something that no one has did before. So just wondering, like, over the years, did you find yourself more into the scene of like, okay, I will just start trial on the scene before like over planning that, and also like, how do you overcome the pressure of like, maybe you need to like do an actual thing and cost on the trial to make things perfect? Thank you.
I think that's a really good question. I would say we learned a lot from our design build years, and we accumulated a lot of materials. We tend to think about materials more than products, so we don't like shop for products out of product catalogs if we can work with materials. We've amassed a certain network of, we call them our freaks and geeks, basically like fabricators who can do all kinds of different things. But we'll, rather than relying solely on the rendering, we're often like doing really crude mock-ups with whatever we have in the office, different materials, steel profiles, whatever it is. I'll also just say, I mean, we try to do mock-ups when we can, when the projects will allow it, or find ways to sort of approximate and get ahead. A lot of the projects we work on, I was thinking about this today, like everyone's gonna come and give a lecture and say, we never have big budgets. We never have big budgets. Like no one has a big budget. I'd say where we excel is where we have realistic budgets. Like you can't do projects if the budgets are unrealistic. Our budgets are always tight. Money is always an issue. And trying to find ways to be inventive or cost effective, I think has allowed our work to thrive, or our practice to have some success. We don't over-render, like, because we find it takes a lot of time, and maybe that's changing, but also it feels like it actually keeps us away from the decisions we're trying to make in a way that, sometimes this is good and sometimes it's bad. There are projects that never happened that we're like, we don't have representation of it because it wasn't built. The stuff, once it's built and it's photographed, like there it is. And we prefer our projects when they're built, they're somehow like more satisfying than how they were imagined, rather than the other way around. Like you see a really impressive imagination of the thing, and then when it's realized, it's somehow a letdown. So I think that wasn't necessarily a goal. I think as a student, I was really interested in representation. You can see through the work we've done with other people's work, we're trying to be really finely tuned to how to develop and communicate like architectural ideas. But sometimes it's literally like, how are we gonna do this? Like we create the problem and now we have to like somehow reconcile it. Like how are we gonna hang this table from this thing? It was kind of a kind of transformative moment, and like also a kind of moment like maybe it kind of broke some of the attitudes I had when I was in architecture school to like action.
Thank you.
Well, this was an absolute treat for me, because having known each other for as long as we have, seeing your old pickup truck in some of the photographs, and there was also a period of time where I think there were probably 3 or 4 practices at Taubman College, and we had an internal competition of who could do the biggest table. Christian did win that, but there were different practices that were all doing design build, and we were all playing off of one another and pushing one another. And I can remember the opening at Six Salon, the first Six Salon, and we would get our clients to hold opening parties where we could invite one another, and there was a really great culture around those things. So for me, this has been a really amazing set of memories that it brings back. So I want to thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing the work.
Yeah.
Thanks, Christian.
Thanks again.